Good morning. First question. Were any of you here last year for Zinfandel? Okay, not a great crowd. Then I don't have to go in. This is going to be a very different kind of presentation as far as format is concerned than last year's, because Zinfandel, the history of Zinfandel is hot in its early years, and it cools off considerably in recent times. It becomes kind of alcohol levels and styles and things like that. This isn't the case with Cabernet Sauvignon. The hot stuff, I think, is really the recent period. And I would like to ask you to take out this little syllabus that college has prepared for me. You see it there? It's got Cabernet Sauvignon, past, present, and future. And I'll refer to these as I run through the second part of my talk. As I say, the drama of Zinfandel history comes from the mysteries and that sort of thing, the lies, all that stuff from the 1880s up into the years shortly after Prohibition. That isn't the case with Cabernet. But there's lots of very interesting information about Cabernet, and I should say red Bordeaux varieties. And you might think Malbec in the 1870s in California. Well, of course, no problem. There was, and the other ones too. So anyway, I will be talking about red Bordeaux varieties as you might say, as a set, but the major subset is Cabernet Sauvignon. Now I'm going to go through this early information up through Prohibition, and then I'm going to stop and say, okay, questions and answers. In other words, we won't wait until the end to go back to how I've proved that a certain person didn't import red Bordeaux varieties that everybody knows did at a very early time. We'll take care of that right at the midway points, and then we'll get into the charts and everything. And most of what I'll be talking about is just mainly directing you toward certain pieces of data that appear in these charts. Some of it is you have to be very careful with, and have to listen very carefully to my explanation of how not to misuse some of this information. And some of it's just plain old downright data. And I honestly don't have any idea. Let me ask you just how many? Don't look at the chart. How many acres of Cabernet in California today? Lots, right? 40, 50,000. How many acres, say, in 1961? Okay. Well, that's the kind of data that's in this, and although it's pretty correct, it's pretty exciting, some of the things, and that's what we'll be doing the second half. First of all, I'll begin with what supposedly is the first import of red Bordeaux varieties in California, probably in the 1840s to Los Angeles. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Good, because if you ever hear about it anymore, just register that there is not one every wine historian in California, Tizer, Penny, Sullivan, Unzelman, Weems, Lapsley hasn't done it. I can't accuse him of that. We all have saluted Jean-Louis Vigne for this red Bordeaux import. And I've been working the last 2.5 years on the history of colonial and provincial wines in California. In other words, from the lower California days in the 1690s through the so-called American conquest in 1846. And there is not one scintilla of evidence to support this. Nothing. And there's a lot that flies in the face. So it didn't happen. When did it happen? Well, first of all, by the time that the California was going in the 1850s, it was clear that Californians who knew something about wine and something about the tremendous amount of booze that was flowing into first the province and then the state through San Francisco, that there was a market to be tapped. And so wine, thousands and thousands of barrels of wine. Actually, in the first days, they were mostly in cases from southern France and some from Spain. And the same thing is true, barrels of brandy and whiskey, huge. So people saw this as a way of making money, just as they did planting potatoes and onions and things like that, to make big bucks in the early days of the gold rush era, which begins in 1848. And these people who knew something about wine imported better varieties. Lots of grapes were coming into California from the East Coast. These were vinifera grapes that were grown on the East Coast in hothouses and nurseries for table. They were not considered wine grapes. Zinfandel was one of them. And it was discovered that it was a pretty good wine grape. Some of these also, like Traminer, and what's the other one? I can't remember. Were also discovered to be fairly good wine grapes. But there was a huge market for table grapes in California. Any kind of fruit or vegetables, because there was no agricultural infrastructure to produce food in California, except three exceptions. Not three, except three. There were three exceptions: beef, wine, and brandy. Brandy, of course, is the aguardiente made from the Mission grape. Wine's the Mission, and there was plenty of wine. But anybody who knew anything about wine knew that dry table wine made from the Mission variety is not particularly good wine. So we start seeing these imports. The first one that we're sure of, and I won't get into the Pinot Noir and things like that because we're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon. The first one is an importation in 1852. And you'll notice that these first three that I give you all are from the Santa Clara Valley. Why is that? They came from France, and there was a huge French population in the Santa Clara Valley. French dominated the foreign population of the Santa Clara Valley in San Jose and around there, just as the Germans dominated the foreign population in the Napa Valley from the 1870s on. Notice I say they're not a majority, but they dominate, and they are extremely important, both groups, in bringing in varieties. For example, a German brought in the first German varieties to San Jose. But the first one's 1852. Antoine Delmas, he brought in Merlot, Merlau, Cabernet, and a bunch of other things too. My mentioning of these varieties by these spellings, it should indicate to you that there's no precise way of knowing really what was coming in. We have no way of knowing exactly what they were. We only know these names. Charles Lafranc also brought in. He's the one who was the early developer of the Almaden Vineyards in the southern part of the valley. And he brought in 57, 58 Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec. And then in 1872, J.B.J. Portal brought in lots of stuff. He was a Burgundy type guy. By the way, if you, as I go along, I'm going to be throwing a lot of names at you in this first part. And as I do it, if you have this, you know what this thing is? This is my Encyclopedia of California Wine History, University of California Press. It's in print. Everything, every concrete term that I use, every noun that's a person or a grape or a place, it has an entry in here. You might wonder about the North Bay. We don't have very much information on red Bordeaux varieties from the earliest years in the North Bay. Zinfandel caught on very fast there in the 1860s as a red wine grape that would be useful to get a piece of this action. But anyway, J.H. Drummond of Sonoma, H.W. Crabb of Napa were noted for their holdings. By the 1880s, when this is the period of the first wine boom in California, when, for example, the acreage of Napa and Santa Clara Valley vineyards went from about 1,000, 2,000 acres to 12 to 15 and 20,000 acres, just in this short period of time. This is the first wine boom. And we have this establishment of the State Viticultural Commission, and Professor Hilgard comes to UC Berkeley and starts some very serious investigations relating to viticulture, primarily at first phylloxera. So anyway, the 1840s, we started hearing lots about what are the ways to get really good wine. Everybody understands Zinfandel is going to be the basis for just California's drinking red, at least every place except the Santa Clara Valley. It took them a long time to pick up on that. But by the mid-'80s, you can hear Charles Wetmore, the CEO of the State Viticultural Commission, calling for more Cabernet to be planted, particularly in the Napa Valley. By this time, it was clear that Napa was red wine country and Sonoma was white wine country. Riesling was very popular, and it had to do with the climate of the southern portions of Sonoma County. Did I say Sonoma Valley? I should say Sonoma County, because there's a lot more to Sonoma than just the valley. But by the mid-'80s, Cabernet is thoroughly established in Napa. And you do see it, for example, Charles Lefranc had a Cabernet Malbec that he began producing from these vines that he brought in the late 50s. And I take that to be the first commercial example of a red Bordeaux wine. Certainly there were other wines made, but I can't find a commercial item before that. J.H. Drummond is generally credited as being the first one really to be very successful and produce a wine which connoisseurs here in California suggested was like a Medoc. Also, we start seeing, as another source of information, we start seeing, as the vineyards expand, you start seeing nurseries expanding their cuttings. So we can look at the ads to nurseries. For example, at Tocolone, H.W. Crabb in the mid-1880s was selling Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Malbec cuttings. And you also would see now and then Verdot, and of course Cabernet Sauvignon. The only place I have ever seen the reference to the difference between Gros and Petit Verdot is in Crabb's listing in his personal nursery, but never as a commercial item. So prior to recent times, the term Petit Verdot did not exist. And of course, after the phylloxera destruction of the 1890s, Verdot didn't exist. It and the other varieties practically disappear, other than Cabernet Sauvignon. Generally speaking, the great Cabernets of these early years of the boom were from Hedgeside in Napa. The winery is up on Atlas Peak Road, the lower part of it, and it was run by a fellow named Morris Esty, who was also a very big man in national Republican politics. Inglenook, of course, by the late 80s and early 90s had gained a name for its Cabernet. Niebaum read lots of European literature and decided to plant it on 5-foot centers, which was unique. Now, one of the things I'll come back to this in a minute. One of the things that's astonishing about the planting of Cabernet in the Napa area is that large amounts of Cabernet and a few of the other red Bordeaux varieties were planted in the Carneros area in what they call the Napa City area. Napa City was quite small, so there was quite an agricultural establishment around where the city of Napa is today. And if you know anything about Cabernet, you wonder, how did they get it right? Well, I've got a theory, but it is remarkable, and I'll give you some stats in a minute that will, I think, make you wonder. Some other producers that were famous was John Doyle at his winery in Cupertino. He had all 5 varieties, and later in the 90s, we start seeing what I call enthusiastic entrepreneurs going in with a capital that they've accumulated someplace else and going in and trying to replicate the great chateau by using all 5 or more than one of the red Bordeaux varieties. I'll mention them in a second. In the East Bay, today where Fremont is, Mission San Jose, so far as Eugene Hilgard was concerned, this was the best place to grow red wine grapes in California, and he had his own vineyard there as well. Charles McKeever at Linda Vista was famous for his Cabernet there in the late 1880s. He's probably more well known for having named the Petit Syrah, the first version to call the Durif Petit Syrah, and then everybody picked up on it. And there was also quite a bit of Cabernet grown in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Surprisingly, again, the best producer, everyone agreed, was John Stewart in the foothills around Scotts Valley. You know, that's pretty cool country too. So there was lots of Cabernet being grown in pretty cool country. We can see where Cabernet was so far as Napa is concerned. And by the way, I keep emphasizing Napa because Napa was where most of it was going on. I've mentioned the other outlying spots, but Napa was really it. In Krug's report, he was one of the commissioners on the State Viticultural Commission in 1888. He lists the Medoc varieties, and he mentions what they are, and they're the big 5. No Carmenere. There's no sign of Carmenere in any literature that I've read. There was 300 and some odd acres. Let me see. Yeah, 387 acres of Cabernet in 1961. How many do you think there would be in 1888? 779. That's a remarkable difference. What that number was equal to is not only huge in terms of what Napa had at a few years after the end of World War II, it's more than the entire state of California had in 1961. 255 of those acres were around St. Helena. This was red wine country, and when you're talking about red wine in St. Helena, you're talking about Zinfandel. Everyone agreed that it was, nobody even considered Sonoma as great Zinfandel country, which today, Sonoma Zinfandel prices are usually a little higher than Napa, and perception. There were 119 acres around Calistoga and 192 acres in the Carneros area. Primarily, I shouldn't say primarily, the biggest grower was John Stanley down on the Stanley Ranch. And when you sweep down on Highway 12, and just before you swing up over that big thing, it's got the statue on top, you look over to the right, and that's all Stanley, the old Stanley Ranch down there. Why were all these grapes, all these Cabernet grapes being grown in land? By the way, is it warmer or cooler in the 1890s in California? Warmer or cooler? Cooler. We are going through, since the 1860s, we have been coming out of what is called the Little Ice Age. And there has been a natural warming. Now, that doesn't mean that all the warming that we've had is the result of the end of the Little Ice Age, but that's part of it. The extent to which human beings have caused this explosion that's a different matter, and that's very controversial. Anyway, this is what I think. I've read the Oldham reports from the Chicago Exposition in 1893, and I've read from also reports, specific analysis of the wines at the Midwinter Fair in 94, 6, and then of course later on in 1915 and 1906, Alaska Yukon, and then here in San Francisco, Panama Pacific International Exposition. And it seems clear to me that people like Cabernet Sauvignon because of the flavor. And as you know, if you bring in Cabernet at, let's say, at 22.5, you get a real distinct flavor, which I am constantly being told today by producers and growers, consumers don't like. And I just don't understand that. But that's what people say. I defy you to find a Grand Cru of Bordeaux, let's say of 1990, 1989, or 2000 that doesn't have that distinct Cabernet flavor, which consumers don't like and are driving the prices of those things. So it's just ridiculous. But anyway, I forget what the chemical is, but it's similar. Anybody remind me? Yeah, that's it. It's also found in bell peppers and other things too. And that doesn't mean, of course, back in the old days, the early days of Monterey Cabernet, there were some other reasons than just because of the cool weather. The Cabernet was coming up tasting like bell peppers, and that is not a good thing. So anyway, that's what I think. I think, first of all, there were no percentage required, and by the way, Cabernet Sauvignon was rarely sold as Cabernet Sauvignon. Remember, most producers did not market their own wines. They sold them to merchants in San Francisco and other places who then made blends for their own particular consumer demands wherever they sold in California or the rest of the country. And this wine traveled, for the most part, under the name Medoc. If it was claret, if it was called claret, it was probably Zinfandel. And it could be any blend that they wanted. There were producers that brought out the wine with the name Cabernet on it. And ever so rarely, Cabernet Sauvignon. And so it's rather difficult when you look at the lists at fairs and things like that to know what it is that you're looking at. But nevertheless, the word was very clear that certain California Cabernet Sauvignon were overwhelmingly Cabernet Sauvignon, or Cabernet was Cabernet Sauvignon, and everybody knew who they were. First of all, there's Tiburcio Parrott. We don't say Perot because the family said Parrott. Up on Spring Mountain, where Spring Mountain Vineyards is today. And everybody, up through the 1930s and 40s, the old-timers looking back, this was the great cab in the 1890s and up after Parrott died, even after that. Two other places, and I think this is one of the beautiful moments in California wine history, and to me it's just as important as the 1976 thing, historically. Two California Cabernets won a gold medal at the Paris Exposition. One from Napa and the other from Santa Clara Valley, except it wasn't the Santa Clara Valley, it was the Montebello Ridge. And it was Pierre Klein, an Alsatian from Montebello Ridge, and it was from a vineyard just below Ridge Vineyards today, a place that's now referred to as Jimsomere. And the other one was up on Howell Mountain, the W.S. Keys, and he won gold medals wherever he showed his wine. And nobody questions this, about these being the super wines, except for the fact that in the eastern part of the United States, the man who produced the American Wine Press and Mineral Spirits Review was an absolute fanatic for a wine made near the Portola Valley by the author of the first technical book on California wine. Anybody know what I'm talking about? E.H. Rixford, right, Emmett Rixford. And right down to the coming of World War I. Rixford wine was it was the wine, if you're going to show a California wine on your table in a swell operation in New York, you had a Rixford. It's called La Cresta. It's not La Cresta, that's Paul Masson. La Cuesta. Cuesta is the Spanish word for hogback, or in German, Stupfenlandschaft. You all know that, of course. I want to mention something that was also happening during these years, and that's the destruction of the premium vineyards in Northern California by the phylloxera, so that the 20,000 acres of bearing grapes in the early 90s in Napa were down to, 2,500 or 3,000 by 1897. So everything had to be replanted. It was almost like the old AXR1 thing, in Napa and Sonoma, where everything was ripped out and everything, tears flowing, and then suddenly, gradually, people started realizing there are some positive things about having to start over. And that was certainly true to a certain extent with California replanting, getting some of those ridiculous varieties out of the vineyards that were planted in the 1870s before anybody knew what they were doing, and they all would get blended up somehow and out. And so anyway, there was a replanting after 1897. You may wonder why 1897. That's the end of the downside of the national business cycle, so that credit started getting easier to. It was easy for us to go to war with Spain, for example. That's what Cleveland, the Republicans, pointed to as making it possible for us to declare war on Spain, is that the business cycle has turned around. So now it would be possible to fund the war. They didn't know about deficit spending, or they'd forgotten it. At the Chicago Exposition, now I was talking about how few the wines were that you could really identify as being made from Cabernet. But Charles Oldham, an Englishman who had a powerful influence on California wine, he was, what should I say? He was the Harry Waugh. I don't want to say Jancis Robinson, but if you don't know who Harry Waugh is, okay, he's the Jancis Robinson. In other words, a person who is from England and learned the wine trade in England and then came to California and became very well known because he could sit down and, sort of independently make these judgments about wine. Of course, as the years went on, he was making a lot of money importing what was called Big Tree. He called Big Tree wine, and got hooked up with the California Wine Association. But in the early years, in '93, I think his evaluations make perfectly good sense. And they can be found, if you can get copies of the Pacific Wine and Spirit Review. I understand that they now have the copies here at Davis, and of course they're in microfilm. Anyway, there were 21 wines that could be identified as being in the Medoc category from Chicago. And it was always understood that meant it came from red Bordeaux varieties, overwhelmingly Cabernet. Now, we don't know. Nobody's doing analysis. You were just supposed to play by the ball game. And these evaluations that were made by Oldham in the Pacific Wine and Spirit Review are really remarkable. there were obviously some very good wines. The best, it looks to me, from his words in 1893, would be John Doyle's down from Cupertino. He's one of the guys who had all five. Perrault up on Spring Mountain, and surprisingly to me, Isaac de Turck in Sonoma. He was one of the big producers there, but he obviously was interested in Cabernet too. You don't see his name associated with it, but suddenly it's Chicago. Of course, if he wanted, de Turck is one of the most honest persons in the industry, but if he wanted to, he could have sent some people over, gotten a barrel of Spring Mountain wine, brought it over, put it in de Turck, and there's nothing to stop him. There's no law against it. It's just, it ain't the right thing to do, you know what I mean? So, in 1915, we also have a fantastic evaluation of California wines at the Panama Pacific International Exposition that was held in San Francisco, you know, down where the marina is, now that beautiful building, what's it called? Palace of Fine Arts, yeah. That's the only thing that survives from that, but the whole place looked like that in 1915. That's where Crissy Field became Crissy Field, and they fly planes in and do loop-the-loops and get killed. One of them did. Crashed in the water out there. But anyway, there is this huge evaluation that comes out in 1915. And boy, you can really see now that these are all commercial people. These were not people who didn't have a brand and were just selling their wine to a wine merchant. And there are very few wines that are identified as Cabernet Sauvignon, a few Cabernets, and Rixford's Cabernet Sauvignon was classified as a claret. So what can we know? Well, we do know that the number one Cabernet that was listed as Cabernet Sauvignon, which won one of the grand prizes. By the way, they went grand prize, Medal of Honor, and there was something else, and then gold medal. So if you got a gold medal, you know, and there were hundreds of gold medals awarded. Anyway, the number one was a winery is just up the road from where I live, owned by Peter Lind in Los Gatos, and he's the only one who got a grand prize. There were tons of others that really got good marks, but as I say, you can't really tell what some of these wines are. And then came World War I, and then came Prohibition. And that's a story. When Prohibition came, there was not much reason for anybody to keep whatever Cabernet grapes or any red Bordeaux varieties. There was just very little reason. So when we come out of Prohibition, in 1933. Actually, the 1933 vintage is the first post-Prohibition vintage, and then 34 is the first one that really makes sense, where things are in order. And maybe 200 acres. And do we have any way of knowing how many there really were? No. Where were they? Almost all of them were in Napa, but there are others, and we have no. Probably the biggest plantation. We don't even know how many acres he had. Who would have the biggest hunk of vines? Anybody know? George de la Tour at Beaulieu, BV. And of course, when the 30s come, he's in a position to get a Cabernet Sauvignon out, which is, it became, the 1941, the 1936 came out, and that became the first BV private reserve with his name on it. Okay, boom, that's how did we do there? Okay, that's not bad. Any questions on up to Prohibition? Yes? Everything you say is true and you're wrong. I don't know whether you realize it or not, but even though agriculture is a business, and who wants to buy these funny-looking grapes? I mean, the Alicante Bouschet is just beautiful. The Zinfandel is beautiful. You put them together and put a little Muscat of Alexandria with it, it's okay. Particularly it's okay in Boston or Newark or New Orleans or no, there was no market whatsoever. I have never, ever seen Cabernet Sauvignon even mentioned as a grape for sale during Prohibition. That doesn't mean there weren't any, but everything you say about the Cabernet is true. It travels pretty well and all this stuff, but no deal. It was not a commercial item. And after 1924, believe me, the first bloom, starting with 1919, there was a tremendous amount of money made selling grapes to home winemakers on the East Coast and Midwest and Washington and Oregon. And then, as usual, we did not exceed the number of wine grapes planted in 1924 until the mid-1970s. There was that kind of explosion. So overexpansion of productive capacity, same old story, agriculture, industry in America, the business cycle. Any other early questions?
Charles, you got a question down here?
Yes.
It's interesting because you would be a very good example of someone to tackle a question like this. Because the question that you proposed was, what happened to all of these grapes in California? Chalachev used to tell me, during Prohibition, Bordeaux continued to sell table wines as older wines because they still had all of their varietal selection shipped as older wines, and they would pack barrels with the bottles layered flat in between straw insulation, and then they would put the head on the barrel and would stamp it flour.
I don't know why they would do this, because it was perfectly legal to ship sacramental wines.
Yes, but these weren't sweet wines.
They didn't have to be. That was sine qua non. No one. There is nothing about sugar content in a sacramental wine, as far as the law is concerned.
You're right. The biggest problem is that there obviously must have been some kind of market during Prohibition for this type of wine, because a normal church that uses, say, a bottle a month isn't going to buy a dry wine.
Well, Darrell, come on now. I know you come from a Roman Catholic family. You know that those priests aren't sitting around waiting for some communion or something to drink the next bottle of wine.
That's the point.
Yeah, but it didn't have to be Cabernet, and Cabernet just didn't produce enough. Now, Delatour did keep his grapes. The Beringers did keep theirs, and Hess, what am I talking about? Gear, where the Hess place is now. Gear kept his cab vines up there too, and people knew but coming out, Horatio Stoll says maybe 200 acres in the whole state, which is, we got that many in Colusa County today, or Siskiyou. But you're right. But remember by the way, the BV Sacramento wine thing. Most of that wine came from Wendy, which became BV number 2, Bonded Winery. They both had to use the same bond number, and the white wines, a lot of the white wines came from the Wendy, and they had a deal with Chalachev. But there's no evidence for this, that Cabernet was but people, naturally, there were people in California who knew that Cabernet was Cabernet. And I think this accounts for the fact that the Beringer family, which was very numerous, keeping a few acres of Cabernet and probably drinking it up themselves and sharing it with their friends. I think But nobody's talking about doing that, and it certainly isn't getting into print. So, and I'm not quite old enough to have been able to talk to a lot of people who were, putting it down in the 20s, so to speak. Okay, no more questions on the early years. Okay, now, if there are any terms that you didn't pick up, they're all in here. Now let's go to these charts. What I want to do is just talk you through a few of them to draw your attention to a few things, but there are all kinds of things to be seen. We've already started out by looking at Napa. There are 387 acres. The 97 in San Benito. What in the world is that? That's Almaden, Frank Schoonmaker, in the late 50s. And we only have 74 in Sonoma. Well, look at what happens to Sonoma by the early 70s. Look what happens between 71 and 75. That rather catches on. There's some other interesting things, too, here. When you look at Napa and you think about AXR1 and you think about replanting, you think about, well, I'll bet you that there's a drop or stagnation here in Napa, or not here in Napa, but in Napa, say when the planting really picks up, 91, 92, 93, the replanting, and you look at those figures and they are pretty stagnant up through 98. And you say, aha. But then you look at the state total and you get the same kind of result. So there are economic factors that are more important than any of the physical factors that would be involved in the replanting, because the same thing happens in Sonoma, and of course there was AXR1 problem in Sonoma, but it was nothing like Napa. So anyway, that's another little thing you can see. Look at Monterey. What happens there between 1968 and 1975? 6,000 acres, and then look what happens in the next years. This is when these vines planted up around Soledad and up toward Monterey Bay were giving you grapes that had that real powerful taste to them, and people didn't like it when that was too overpowering. And Monterey is just all over the place. I think the most dramatic statistic here is the one where you look at San Luis Obispo. That's the Paso Robles area. Look what happens there as you go. It's just remarkable. There are almost 10,000 acres there. There probably are 10,000 today. Another eye opener is SJL. I didn't say what that meant. That means San Joaquin Lodi. Now the San Joaquin viticultural district isn't just San Joaquin County. It goes up almost to the Sacramento city limits because from a meteorological and soil and everything, there's the county line is meaningless there. So anyway, that's something that this chart. Keep this thing around. Anybody know where you can get statistics like this? Because I had to take them out of, volumes of stuff from the state, but nobody's ever put them together. I've put a few together to do the companion. Down at the second chart on there refers to the percentage of growth. So look at Cabernet 98, 99. I mean, that's just huge. But now look how stagnant it's been. In other words, so far as growth goes, it's pretty much held its own. But then when you look back at San Joaquin, notice in the mid 90s they've got 3,000 or 4,000 acres, and now they're up to 10,000 acres. So where it's growing there, it's not growing or maybe declining in some other areas. You can see this in certain Central Valley counties that overplanted Cabernet like crazy, and then suddenly the next year it's almost all gone. The second chart, I presume, does your second chart say Cabernet Sauvignon tons crushed? Yep. Okay. Here again, looking at Napa is really interesting. I've taken just recent years here, but look down at the bottom. What percentage of the state Cabernet is Napa Cabernet? And now look what it is today. It's just a little more than half of that. And then if you look at the Central Coast, well, why golly, it looks like it's flat, but it's not. In 2014%. And so why is it back? Well, Monterey is down and Paso Robles is up. And just cursory examination of those statistics looks like Central Coast is pretty steady, but it's not. And of course, when you look at North Coast in 1990, and by that I mean Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Lake, and a little bit of Solano, 46 to 27. So that 27 is still a powerful number when you look at the total production of Cabernet Sauvignon in California. But the fact, of course, that it's dropped to 27 doesn't mean there's been any kind of a decline in acreage. It's just a relative decline. Now, the next chart, Cabernet Sauvignon grape prices per ton. This takes a little bit of explanation. First of all, look at the 2006 for Napa, 41.26. Remember that number, 41.26. In fact, if you are an Andy Beckstoffer person, you put a dot between the 1 and the 2. Know what I mean? If you don't, I'll explain it to you. Okay, now just below that, these are just phenomenal growth in tons, prices per ton in Napa, and in the state itself, it's down since '98. Lodi is less than half. Sonoma is up at a much more reasonable rate. Well, what do I mean by reasonable? Let's look at the consumer price index. Well, you can't see it on here, but I figured it out. And if in '98 the price, okay, in $98, okay, the $84 in 2006. You can do this on the computer. Bureau of Labor Statistics, they've got a little chart. You go, tick, tick, tick. You see, you ask it, it says, the dollar. You say, a dollar. What was a dollar worth in relationship to now for this? And then you punch in 22.55 or 961. See those two numbers there? And then you punch in the date, 1984 and 1998, and you get 1864 and 2789, which make fairly good sense for Napa, and definitely make good sense for Sonoma, and continue to make good sense for Sonoma when you go to 2006. But look what's happened to Napa since 2000. It's just grown exponentially as far as the price of grapes is concerned. One of the things you can do by examining the state statistics is to determine, believe it or not, I don't know if any of you have done this, but you can look in there and tell what each individual lot of grapes sold for and how many tons there were. In other words, they will take Napa or Sonoma, that's regions 3 and region 4. That's that's not region 3 and 4, regions, but, that's the numbers that the state gives it. And you can take each variety, and they start with the cheapest to the most expensive, and they tell you how much each lot was. They don't tell you who it is. Some of them because particularly in Napa, when you get up to the top, what a couple of those are. So anyway, we know that that's going to be really an exciting number at the top, wherever you go, so far as the most expensive Cabernet grapes go, whether you're in Paso Robles or the Alexander Valley or in the Napa Valley. But what about the cheap Cabernet grapes in Napa? How is it that my wife and I were able to go into Beverages and More and get a bottle of $5 Napa River Cabernet? It tastes pretty good. It's got to be, the Supreme Court. It's got to be Napa grapes, 75%. Well, down here it tells you that in 2006, there were 837 tons of grapes that were sold between $250 and $1,500. And 1,500 tons, and that's going to make about 1 million bottles of wine. But still, and you wonder, where do these $15 bottles of Cabernet come from? Well, that's where they come from. Somebody is producing Cabernet and selling it for $1,200, $1,500, $1,600, but it's only 4.2% of the total. Are you nudging me? Okay. I got these two to go. Okay, now the next thing, read this carefully. These prices, California Cabernet prices, in the bottle for Napa and the rest of the state come only from Connoisseur's Guide. I know of no other place. They do about 400 Cabernet bottles per year. But by looking at the prices that they give, you cannot come up with the price of the average bottle. You come up with the price of the average release. But I do it the same way each year using the same system so I can make comparisons. So for example, 2007, they did 237 releases. Now, by releases, I mean Diamond Creek has how many releases? Three or four. But anyway, and they're all $250 a bottle. And I punch in that $250 each time, 3 or 4 times. And if there's a $15 one, that only goes to 15. So this obviously cannot, you can't look at that number and say that's the average price of a bottle of Napa wine. But when you compare when you look at the changes, you can see the direction that changes are taking, the prices are taking. And you can see the relationship between Napa Cabernet and Cabernet from other regions, and then you can look at the total. Now I said, remember that 4126? According to the Beckstoffer principle, that's what the average bottle of Napa Cabernet should cost. $41.26, his Napa Valley wine growers formula. And that's just about what it is. See, now this gives this at $65.74. That is not right, but I think that the $40 price, but there's no way of telling. You would have to know how many gallons of every release there was, and it just becomes, I don't even want to think about it. Okay, the next should be Napa weather. Is that right? Okay, don't look at it yet. Is it getting warmer or cooler? This is for Napa. Warmer or cooler? No, you don't answer. You'd say that's a stupid question. You don't care about how cool it gets in Napa in December. In fact, you don't care about nighttime temperatures in Mediterranean climates with maritime influence as in the California coastal valleys. The old Kirpin classification, CSBVN. The N is for fog. So anyway, you can look at you should only look. You wouldn't do this for Burgundy by any means, but for our coastal valleys, you only look at the high temperatures because the evening temperatures are almost a constant during the growing season. And so you can look at the average high temperature for the growing season. Let's say from mid-March to end of August. And then you can look at the vintage season, say from the end of August through the end of October. Now, is Napa getting warmer or cooler? Okay, I figured it out. Day by day. That's because I keep day-by-day statistics for Napa and Santa Clara Valley. And you can see these on here. And the answer is, surprisingly, it's very close, but it's the vintage season and the growing seasons have been slightly cooler in the last 9 years than in the previous 9 years. How does this relate to an important controversy today? Hang time. When they tell you that it is the growing, the heating of the atmosphere, the growth in high temperatures that is causing the rise of what? Bricks. By the way, if you want to know about Napa bricks, there it is in the 23s, in the 90s, and it's up in the 25s now. Is that 23 to 25 the result of warmer vintage temperatures? Answer is no. But the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. The last one is something that Deborah, she didn't suggest that I do it. She put it in the advance notice for this thing that I was going to be relating to all of the varieties, and I didn't do it. So this is an addition. It's got some stats for Sonoma, San Joaquin, San Luis Obispo, meaning Paso Robles, for the other four, I guess they call it. Yeah, the other four, because you've got the Cabernet Sauvignon in your first chart. Now, Deborah made a mistake in introducing me because I'm a historian. I don't predict the future. And when you hear historians predicting the future, say, you're a historian and you've never heard of Charles Beard? Okay, thank you very much.